Our lecture today is going to be on the exciting medium of photography. Now, photography is so different compared to other mediums because for the first time we have a medium that we can definitely say has a birthday. On August 19th, 1839, this guy here, Louis-Jacques Daguerre, stands in front of a joint meeting of the Academy of Sciences and the Academy of Fine Arts in Paris and explains to them what photography is and how it can be used and the development process. The French government is so impressed that they give Daguerre a pension that will last for the rest of his life, and they also let him name the first photographic process after himself, the Daguerreotype. But a lot of us question whether or not photography is art. Because when we look at art in general, it seems to be a God-given talent. If I asked you to draw a bird, could you draw one authentically? And only a small amount of people probably could. But if I asked a class, how many of you can photograph? Well, all of us can. In fact, the majority of us have cameras attached to our phones, and we regularly take images. We have no way of deciding, of course, what's good and what's bad in terms of photographs. How can we tell if a professional took an image such as this one here? Can we assign this to a famous photographer such as Ansel Adams? Or what about like this photograph here? Could we again associate it with Ansel Adams' images of Yosemite? Or was this just a tourist who happened to have a good eye and a very expensive camera? We should take a look first, though, at the precursors of photography. Now, photography is troublesome to me because we had the knowledge and we also had the equipment to create the camera as early as the year 1400. Way back during the Renaissance. So the first precursor we'll look at is the silhouette machine, where you have this model sitting in a chair, a light source on one side of her, and her image then transmitted onto the tracing paper at her right. The artist behind the tracing paper traces her image, and it's later going to be filled in with ink or black construction paper. And we'll get an image similar to this. Silhouettes were extremely popular all the way through the Victorian age and would serve very much as portraiture does, above a fireplace mantle or down a hallway. More importantly, though, is the camera obscura. And in Latin, this term translates into darkroom, and that's exactly what these were. These were originally room-sized chambers that were set out in the landscape. A small hole or aperture on one side of them that would serve as a lens, and it would transmit the image of the outside world onto the inside tracing paper. And then you, as the artist, would stand in the center of the room and trace the image. Over time, though, the camera obscuras became smaller, they became portable. They were fitted with true lenses and mirrors to make the drawing easier for the artist. However, the problem was that these images were ephemeral, and they had to be traced in order to be kept. A couple of the questions that you may see on an exam is who invents photography and who gets credit for inventing photography. Two totally different questions and, of course, two totally different answers. When we consider the first question of who invents photography, the answer is, well, lots of people do. Photography is helped out by people such as Nicephore Niepce, who invents the process of heliography. We have William Henry Fox Talbot, the father of photogenic drawing, which is the basis for modern photography. Hippolyte Bayard, Sir John Herschel. All of these people helped the process of photography to what we know it as today. However, the person who gets credit for photography, the short answer, is Louis-Jacques Daguerre. For some reason, we associate photography with him, even though he doesn't do a whole lot, and once photography is invented, he really doesn't do anything anymore. All the rest of the people I showed you continue the advancement of the medium, and this guy does not. I'll tell you Daguerre's story in a little bit, but he just happens to be at the right place at the right time. And he is in all the art history books. So we'll take a look at this early type of photography. And we start with the heliograph, which is invented by Nicephore Niepce, who had a camera obscura, and he put a pewter plate about the size of a 3x5 card roughly into a camera obscura. It was covered with bitumen of Judea, an asphalt compound, and he sets this on his windowsill, pointing out toward his estate, which in the center of the image you're basically seeing chicken coops. And after 8 hours of exposure time, we have the view from the window at Gras, our very first photograph in 1826. After the exposure time, he takes the plate out of the camera obscura, rinses it with the saltwater solution, holds it upside down over heated iodine to bring out this latent image. So in 1830, he meets Daguerre, and Daguerre is working in Paris as a set designer, a set painter, a painter of dioramas, and the two meet, become friends, and collaborate on the process of heliography. And Daguerre does give a couple of suggestions. He says that instead of using a pewter plate, why not use highly polished silver? Instead of iodine vapor, let's change that medium out to mercury. And these help bring out a much clearer image. Now in 1833, Niepce dies suddenly, and that leaves Daguerre with all of the research to present to the Academy of Fine Arts and Academy of Sciences on that day of August in 1839, and the French government embraces photography. They've literally beaten the British to the invention. And Daguerre gets a state pension that will last the rest of his life, which is about 10 years. And he walks off into the sunset, basically, as a pseudo-celebrity. So we'll take a look at a daguerreotype and how it's created. We'll start with this image here, the view of the artist studio. You can see compared to the heliograph earlier how clear and much more well-defined this image is. The exposure time is also a lot less. Instead of looking at an 8-hour exposure, in early 1839 we're looking at about 8 minutes. And by the end of 1839, less than 20 seconds. But daguerreotypes are a huge process. It's not something like a Polaroid camera is to us, and definitely not at all like digital photography. All of this equipment and chemicals are needed just to prepare the plate itself for exposure. The exposure is taken in a daguerreotype camera. Then we have the chemicals and such we need for the developing process. We need to then hand color in the eyes. When you have your photograph taken, even though you may be able to sit still for the length of the exposure, you still have a problem with the eyes not becoming visible because we're constantly blinking during that time frame. So the eyes are painted in afterwards. And then we want to protect and preserve and, of course, present these new photographs of ourselves. I have a video that I'll place online for you to watch that literally goes through the process of creating a daguerreotype, and it's about 7 or 8 minutes long, but again, that'll be on our online site. When photography is invented, it becomes a mania. In fact, the French painter Paul Delaroche, upon seeing his first daguerreotype, exclaimed that painting was dead, and really it was. It immediately put out of business several of the portrait painters because photography was much easier, much quicker, and even more accurate than a painting was. Definitely, it was also more economical. So people would run out and get their photographs taken. You can see a family in the upper left-hand corner and a young Abraham Lincoln in the upper right, siblings, and even a individual who's prideful of his work. In order to sit still for that length of time of the exposure, many people had used head clamps to keep their patrons still. Although there are some images, and these are highly collectible, of people who didn't need head clamps. These individuals, these young children, have all passed away, most likely from tuberculosis. Remember, in the mid to late 1800s, we have a very high child mortality rate. And while we look today at these images being very cumbersome, very morbid, that these weren't their intention, that they were lovingly taken of these children. Postmortem photography is one of the most collectible parts of daguerreotype collecting. That and animals were both very, very rare. And a very nice daguerreotype done up in the red velvet case with the hinges still attached may fetch anywhere up to $10,000. You can normally buy a daguerreotype at an antique store for anywhere between $35 and $70, depending on the condition, mostly of the frame itself. Many of them are broken or missing. There'll be also a short video on postmortem photography on the website as well if you want to take a look at an exhibition that happened a few years ago. Now, with as wonderful as photography is, there were some drawbacks. And besides the length of time it took for exposure, we look at this street, and this is a busy Paris street. But it looks as if it is vacant or taken in the early morning, and that's not the case. The street is literally as busy as this street is here. But the problem is everything's in motion. When people are walking around, horses and carriages are moving, they're not able to be captured because the exposure time. We noticed that one person in the lower left-hand side was captured in kind of a ghostly image. And this is because he stopped long enough to have his shoes shined. We also have drawbacks, being that daguerreotypes are unique images. They can't be reproduced. They are what's called direct positives. So if we wanted to take another image of this street corner, we would literally have to take another image. We couldn't reproduce the one we had. And also the use of mercury fumes in the development process is extremely toxic. Many celebrities would have their photographs taken. This is what's called a full plate daguerreotype. Instead of something being about the size of a business card, here you have something about the size of a piece of paper. And what photography studios would do is they would run out and find a celebrity and have them sit for their studio. And they would take two images, one to give to the celebrity at no cost and the other to put in their storefront window. just how you would see delis in New York or Los Angeles with images and autographs of famous people that have eaten there, as if to give them or their food some credence. Same thing was done with photography. I'm going to talk about photogenic drawing real quick. And photogenic drawing was invented by William Henry Fox Talbot. You don't need to know too much about the process, but I'm just going to tell you the paper that you see here is soaked in silver chloride, the plant specimen laid on top. You have glass on top of that, and it is exposed to sunlight for about 15 minutes. And what you get is this type of an image. And what William Henry Fox Talbot has done is he's invented the negative. He's also created a piece that is on paper rather than metal. So it is reproducible and it's on paper. It is the basis for modern photography. And we see a lot of these early photogenic drawings as plant samples. Now, when photography is introduced, of course, it becomes a mania, but a lot of people are not sure how to quite use it. When we look at the different topics such as entertainment, science, documentation, politics, social reform, feminism, and art, these are just a few of the many, many topics that you can categorize photography into. In fact, you may have an image that has 2 or more topics related to it. But for the purposes of this lecture, we're just going to go with these 7. And we'll start with entertainment. The stereograph or stereo card is something that was very popular during the 1850s. You can still get them today. You know, they're sold as Viewmasters. And if you had a Viewmaster as a kid, or you go to the store and buy one, there's a small circular seal that literally says stereograph on the plastic. Now, the stereograph helps you look at a stereo card, which is made out of compressed cardboard, and it looks like it has the same image on both sides, but it's not. It's taken at a slightly different angle, and when you look through the stereograph, it has kind of a 3-dimensional image to it. These were very, very collectible for the time, showing images of such as the World's Fair of 1851, or showing Confederate soldiers. Even something as, well, not commonplace, but something new would be trains. And so people would collect these. They would trade them very much like we traded baseball cards as children. And even today, there were so many of these produced that they really are not expensive. You can buy these, again, from an antique store for probably about $2 each, depending on the subject matter. Some subjects are rare, and they may run up to $10 or $12. But for the most part, these are very, very inexpensive, and to have something from the mid-1800s is pretty cool. Carte de visites, as well as cabinet cards. Again, some uses of entertainment and photography. When we look at photography and science, we can see how it's related in this image by Thomas Eakins of the pole vaulting man, and we basically trace the body's locomotion. In the late 1800s, we're interested in these chronophotographs, literally translated into photographs of time. The physiology of the body, how it moves. And what's exciting about these images is these are embraced by the Lumiere brothers. And with this type of photography, we have the basis for motion pictures. We have astronomy, operations being photographed, and also when you think about it, when doctors take x-rays, that is simply a photograph. Photograph and documentation. The burning of the Oswego Mills is an early form, I would even say, of photojournalism, but it fails because the exposure time is still so long. We don't get to see the flames that are burning this mill down. We don't get to see the people rushing around trying to put the fire out. But cameras become very standard expeditionary equipment. We start to see images of far-off places we've only read about. We now see images for the first time of the ancient ruins of Greece or of Rome. Antarctica is again photographed for the very first time in the early 1900s. Police photography. War photography. The Crimean War is the very first war that's photographed. However, again, because of the exposure time, we usually see images from before the battle, or we might see images from after the battle. We also see some horrific images from the Civil War. And we can also see how different, how raw, how truthful these photographs are compared to something in painting that tends to be romanticized. By the time we get to the 1860s, we have a new process called the wet plate collodion process. And you can see this image is shattered, and that's because it's on glass rather than metal. And you can also see how clear this image is. Now, I'll also have online for you a video of Sally Mann, who uses this process today. Literally 100 years after people stopped using it, she uses the wet plate collodion process in her contemporary photographs. So I'll show you a few others here for documentation. And Dorothea Lange documents here the Great Depression, and she is very much a person who is charged with humanizing the Depression. When she took this photo, she talks about it about 30 years later. In the 1960s, she's interviewed, and we only see one image, but she actually took 5. And she says, I moved closer and closer without even talking to this woman, taking exposures as I went. And you kind of see her in a tent that is set up behind her. There is off to the right her car, which is up on blocks, and the tires are gone. She had just sold them to buy food for her children. And she explains once she talked to Dorothea Lange that she was 33 years old, and they had been surviving on frozen vegetables from the fields and also birds that the children had killed. With photography and politics, we have the famous image of Abraham Lincoln by Matthew Brady. Now, Matthew Brady at this time is not famous yet. He's a portrait studio artist, but he's going to become a very famous Civil War photographer. Abraham Lincoln, who's a senator at the time, goes to him to have his image taken to be run in newspapers. There are rumors that he is ugly and he is malformed, and those rumors actually are true. With Abraham Lincoln, he's still our tallest president that we've ever had, and Matthew Brady even makes him curl his attenuated fingers underneath at his right-hand side, just so they don't become obvious to the viewer. He also shines a bright light in the senator's face, and this is the image that is published. Later on, after he's elected president, Abraham Lincoln, even in speeches attributes Matthew Brady to, quote, making him president. As I said, Matthew Brady goes on to become a very famous Civil War photographer. If you've seen the Civil War series by Ken Burns, most of those images are taken by Matthew Brady. He photographed the North as well as the South, and even several presidents. I think something like 13 different presidents sat for him in front of the camera. Moving on to more current, this is an image of President Kennedy, just as he is going to give the commencement speech at Columbia University. We have his assassination. And we'll move to social reform. One of the books that you need to know about is How the Other Half Lives. And this is a book written by Jacob Riis, who was a police reporter, and he worked Manhattan's Lower East Side, which would be known as the slums. And he and his friends would go out at night, and they would take images, such as these, showing the people and how they lived. And these would then be published, and these people, with their lodging here, this is actually a room in a morgue. And you can see the extreme poverty here, and what Jacob Riis's images did was brought this to the forefront of people's attentions in the late 1800s. His book, first published in 1892, is still in print today. Another person who is attributed to social reform is Lewis Hine. And Lewis Hine is known more today for these photographs of the buildings of skyscrapers in New York. The change of the skyline, the workers very competent at their tasks. However, earlier on in his career, he was concerned with newspaper stories such as this, or images like this. The idea of children being put to work in factories and mills and coal mines. And what Lewis Hine would do is he would, under false names, get hired on at these places. And after a while, he would sneak his camera in and take photographs of these young children, not being actively abused, but working very long hours in dangerous conditions. And he worked freelance for the National Committee on Child Labor. And the basis of these photographs give us, and we look at them today as being very nostalgic, but they are the basis for our child labor laws today. Now, moving on to the 70s and 80s, we have photography and feminism. One of the most important photographers in this arena is Cindy Sherman, who is not only the photographer here, but she is also the person in the photograph. She is famous for her self-portraits, and they're extremely good. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, she created this untitled film still series where she would dress up in different characters. Everything from this young country girl coming to the city to find work, to a seductress or a housewife. And these images over time became larger, and then they were in color as the later ones go. There's about 70 of them altogether. They don't go numbered 1 through 70. They skip numbers. But the idea is that these show women in various aspects of how they're portrayed in television or advertising or movies, usually portraying the woman as the victim. The size of these photographs also increased. The very first ones, like a 5x8 photo, but by the time we get to these ones here in the early 80s, these are literally maybe 2 feet by 3 feet in length. Cindy Sherman is also noted for selling the most expensive photographs, or they get the most money when they go to auction. This one selling for nearly $4 million in 2011. Cindy Sherman is still photographing today. She tends to do series of images. In this one, she dressed up as another artist in his self-portrait, and she does this for various paintings as well. But we should also consider the aesthetic value of art, of photography as art. And, you know, we look at the Civil War image here by Timothy O'Sullivan, and it's not necessarily aesthetically pleasing by any means. Timothy O'Sullivan worked under Matthew Brady and would go out and literally photograph during the battle these people, and twice he had his camera shot out of his hands. Now, as I said, these aren't necessarily aesthetically pleasing, but what Timothy O'Sullivan does after the Civil War is that he joins the U.S. Geological Survey crew. Among others in this crew would be like Ansel Adams, and they go out and photograph the West. And you can see these incredible, beautiful landscape images. I want to touch on a couple photographers as well that are famous. Diane Arbus, who is noted as the photographer of freaks. Her image of the boy holding the toy hand grenade is one of her most famous. And even though we see this young man that has a strap falling from his shoulder and a grenade in one hand and his other hand very much in the position of a talon of a bird, his eyes kind of bugging out and his hair messy. This is the image Diane Arbus chose to show us. She had gone to Central Park that day and photographed this young kid, and in the series of photos that she took, in 11 of them, he looks like a fine, happy young boy, but the one that she chose that was so different was the one in the upper left-hand corner. That's the one she chose to show us. She liked to play with juxtaposition. There was definitely some humor in her works. Her works get about $400,000 when they go up for auction. And her most famous one are the twins, which Stanley Kubrick used for his twins in The Shining. Then we had also Sally Mann, a more contemporary artist. And this is the lady who uses the wet plate collodion style. You can see the old camera at her right. And it's a photographic process that hasn't been used in 100 years. And I'll put a video online for you to watch about how she creates these beautiful images on glass. She started out with mostly doing landscape photography on her ranch. I believe it's out in Wyoming. But her most famous images would be like the controversial images of her young children in very adult situations many times. But there were also some controversial images with taking nude photos of her children as they got older. She had even been accused of child pornography. And she and her children argue against that. And with these images also, you have to figure that, you know, these are not going to grandma and grandpa like so many of our young photographs do of our kids. You know, these are literally going to the Museum of Modern Art. We also want to take a look at photography publications. The first one is The Pencil of Nature, which is by William Henry Fox Talbot. He's the guy who brought us photogenic drawing, the idea of creating a negative, the idea of using paper instead of metal. He also published the very first book of photographs. And this really kind of showed the different uses of this medium. In this case, it was the use of photography as an inventory measure. And the book was usually set up with a plate at the left-hand side and then a short description at the right. But what's exciting about the book also is that it does give us the idea that even early on, there was aesthetic value addressed to photography. That we can say, yes, photography can be categorized as an artistic medium. This is a photograph after a famous Dutch still life painting called The Open Door. We already spoke about How the Other Half Lives with Jacob Riis, and this was about social reform. And then we have Life magazine. And Life magazine is important for American photographers. The idea that with photography, this was the outlet for us as Americans. For 30 years, this magazine provided us a magazine that was heavy in pictures and light on words. And with that, that is going to be the end of the photography presentation. We're going to next week deal with Edward Manet, and we'll probably also be dealing with some architecture as well.